Good afternoon, class. We're glad to have you once again in our course of studies here at the Greens Lake Road Church of Christ, Chattanooga School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. This course of study is going to have to do with two great Old Testament books, the book of Ecclesiastes and the book, the Song of Solomon. I think you're going to enjoy these good studies. They're challenging because they have some interesting statements in them that a lot of people have difficulty with, but we'll enjoy looking at them and studying through these things and learning a great deal from God's Word once again. Relative to matters concerning the book of Ecclesiastes, first of all, only has 12 chapters. The chapters are not long. 8 chapters in the book of Song of Solomon, and they're not very long either. So we'll average about 2.5 chapters per class, and I think we'll be able to do that without a great deal of difficulty. Introductory matters, of course, will become in our first class here. The book of Ecclesiastes. The word Ecclesiastes, the title of the book, you may have in your Bible underneath the word the Ecclesiastes, it says, or, comma, the preacher of all things. Well, that's the way it's put there. You see, Ecclesiastes is an anglicized form of a word which appears in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew. And the Hebrew word is the word kohelet, K-O-H-E-L-E-T-H, which literally means the idea of one who holds an assembly or addresses an assembly. Hence the idea of the preacher is a good indication of what the book really is all about. So the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of the preacher, if you will. Traditionally, it was told, we're told, and biblically, as a matter of fact, we find that the book was written by a man by the name of Solomon. Not unfamiliar to you or any student of the Bible at all. Solomon, in the very first verse of the book, says, the words of the preacher, the king is the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So we would encourage you to have your Bibles out and take notes as we go through this class, if you will. You might notice also in verse 12, it says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. And so Solomon, again, pretty well identified rather conclusively that he's the case. And you might look on over in chapter 2 also, and verse 7, you'll find this phrase there. He says, I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house, and also I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. That certainly well describes Solomon and his life of plenty in Jerusalem as he ruled as king over the land for some 40 years in the process. Solomon is the author of the book. Some people try to credit the authorship to somewhat of a later date by an anonymous author as such, but we just simply reject that. We'll go with what the Bible says about it and let that be satisfactory, and that'll be where we'll kind of put our peg down relative to the authorship of the book of Ecclesiastes. Some people say, well, the facts described in the book of Ecclesiastes are not compatible with the facts of the days of Solomon's life. But when we go back and read about the days of Solomon's life, and you would find, in fact, the facts really do match pretty well the facts in Solomon's life as you would go back and read those things. By the way, the historical background for the book of Ecclesiastes can be found in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, chapter 1, the first 11 chapters of that book, and also in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 29, through 2 Chronicles in chapter 9. So those two historical references as far as the historical background for the book. We want to think about the theme of this great book, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in just a moment as we begin the text of it. But basically, here's a great key to understanding the book of Ecclesiastes. The theme of it is that life is viewed solely from man's wisdom apart from God. What does that mean? Simply this, that if we looked at life, in which we are a part of in our day and age, as was the case in the days when Solomon wrote these things, and we left God out of our life, then the book of Ecclesiastes gives a good description of what life would really be about or like if that were the case. And so Solomon is going to pursue that particular case. In fact, his conclusion is that it's all vanity. That is, it's useless or worthless or no value as such. Life without God is vanity. It emphasizes the futility of human philosophies as far as its regard to God. Disregard of God. We live in a day and age where it seems to be an ever-increasing concept to more and more disregard God. And so we may find these great lessons in the book of Ecclesiastes very helpful also in our day and age. And it's going to emphasize in the latter part of the book. Brother Roy Deaver, in his comments and introduction, says in the first 10 chapters of the book, it explores the various attitudes and philosophies with references to life, and shows that from the viewpoints of each, that all is vanity. He says that's the basic thrust of chapters 1 through 10. And then in chapters 11 and 12, he says it simply emphasizes the right attitude toward life. In chapters 11 and 12, the right attitude toward life. Good thing to think about. I want to give us some key words and key thoughts about the book of Ecclesiastes before we get into it. And these are significant and important and actually absolutely critical if we're going to have a correct understanding of the book and be able to read the book with understanding and proper application thereof. One key word is the word indeed vanity. The word vanity. We have different numbers, how many times it's used in the book itself. Someone says 31. I said, I'm just going to count them, so I did. I got 34, and then I went over to the eSword and ran a check on it, and they came up with 37 terms. But anyway, very often used in the book of Ecclesiastes, the word vanity, used very often in the book of Ecclesiastes. Simply means that something is of futility, that it is useless, and that it is worthless. It is of no profit. In fact, Solomon uses the term sometimes, what profit is there about things and such. If it's all vanity, it is none whatsoever. And there's another key thought in the book of Ecclesiastes, and you want to take note of this also, and that key thought is the phrase, under the sun. You'll find that expression, some say some 28 times. There's a couple of verses where it's used twice, and so you might add a couple more to that number up to about 30 or so. Under the sun. Well, what does that mean? That simply means, in essence, that which is apart from God, or life as it is viewed under the sun on this earth, where God is not taken into consideration. That's the idea. And so a lot of the statements that you would read in the book of Ecclesiastes would seem to be contradictory to very basic fundamental Bible knowledge. But when we put it in the context of the general concept of being under the sun, that is where God is not considered, then indeed it makes all the sense that one would expect it to make in those concepts. This is one of the great books of wisdom, one of the 5 as we generally know them in the Old Testament there, and so therefore we read it with great encouragement to do that. God has given us in the book of Ecclesiastes the record of all human thinking and natural religion has ever been able to discover concerning the meaning and goal of life. That's a statement made by a fellow by the name of H.C. Mears. What man has thought about life. And so we would encourage you to think about that. Join us as we enter this great study. Take your Bible. Let's begin at chapter 1 and verse 1. And we'll begin our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. First thing we want to do as we look at the textual aspect is to get a general concept of the flow of the information which we'll find in the book of Ecclesiastes. The first few verses are very important, as usually is the case in God studying God's Word. All of them are such. But here's what we call, some people call it the prologue. It's an introduction of that which Solomon is going to speak about during the course of this particular study in our book here. He gives the title of the book, he gives the theme of the book and process, and going down beginning about verse 12 in chapter 1 and going all the way through chapter 6. In general, we have a general discussion of things or a demonstration of the vanity of the things under the sun. And so he's going to bring forth various items, various situations, various concepts, various elements, and simply discuss them and demonstrate the fact that they are vain or they are vanity as viewed from under the sun. And then in chapter 12, on through chapter 7, probably verse 1 on through chapter 12, he draws some deductions from the previous research that he's made, and he gives some rules and warnings from life. And so these are going to be very helpful to us as we go through. Let's go to chapter 1. Chapter 1. Verse 1 says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And so here we have the words of Solomon. He identifies himself as such, And this really begins we might say, the title of the book, and then the theme of the book is set forth pretty solidly in verses 2 and 3 at the very outset of the book of Ecclesiastes. Let's read these two verses together. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2 and 3. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Verse 3, what profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? Here in these two verses we have introduced to us and given to us the general thrust and the thesis of this great book. Vanity of vanity, he says all is vanity, and then he puts the description on that, there is no profit to man of anything that's viewed from under the sun. If we on this earth, if our life is confined just to this earth and to the affairs and to the elements of this earth, to the activities thereof, and if that's all there is no God, there is no life after as such, it's really a vain thing. It has no real true profit or benefit in the process. It's just a matter of period of time while we're here and suffer whatever we may be here, whatever circumstances may be, and then that's it. But that's not the case at all. But Solomon wants to go back and to examine these things, and I believe that this book gives us a great idea. Someone has made the observation that if you really want to understand what life is all about, what life would be like without God, then go back and read and study the book of Ecclesiastes. Here is life as we live it day by day. Here are enumerated within the context of this great book the various aspects, the great elements of our life, the great relationships that we often have, and he's brought to this great thing, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now then, before we go any further relative to the theme, we've put forth the first verses of the book. I want to go with you to the very last two verses in the book, because I don't want us to lose our balance in what we're trying to do. The last two verses of the book. These verses are verses which are probably most familiar to the students of the Bible when it comes to the book of Ecclesiastes. Here's where Solomon has drawn up some conclusions, and he says this is the conclusion of the whole matter. As soon as I get to chapter 12, we're going to read those two verses. Chapter 12, verse 13 and verse 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. That's what the matters or things he's been discussing in this book. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. What is it, Solomon? Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. The word duty is supplied by the translator. This is what man is about in reality. And so before we get entangled with some of the language of the book of Ecclesiastes, and before we might scratch our head and wonder what about life, is it worth, what have you, we need to understand that the point to which Solomon ultimately is going to arrive is simply this. Fear God. That's what life is about. Keep his commandments. That's how we reverence and respect God. Verse 14, he says, God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So just wanted to put that in balance for us as such. Whatever else may be said between chapter 1, verse 1, 2, and 3, and chapter 12 and verse 13, the conclusion of all that is found in verses 13 and 14 of Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Keep that in mind, and we won't go astray as we go down through the study of the Word. Let's begin with some things about here. Verses 4 through 11. I want you to write a note at the top of your paper, write it down somewhere and put it in your notes. Here's a statement from Brother Franklin Camp, great and beloved gospel preacher, now no longer among us on this earth as such, taken from his works, Redemption Through the Bible, a study on the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, taken from page 42. And here's what Brother Camp says about the book of Ecclesiastes. Quote, the book of Ecclesiastes deals with a man searching to find out some purpose in life apart from God. Now that's a rather straightforward statement, but it is so well descriptive of what the book is really all about. I'm going to say it once again, so you'll be sure to get it down. The book of Ecclesiastes deals with a man searching to find out some purpose in life apart from God. Franklin Camp is the author of that statement. Franklin Camp. Now then, when we began, verses 12 through 18, we'll have another statement, Brother Camp, so you help me be to remember that, hopefully that. Help us. Brother Camp is such a great student of the Bible, a great teacher, if you will. Verses 4 through 11. Here's one of his statements about these verses. Here's what Brother Camp says about these verses here, 4 through 11. A view of life without faith. A view of life without faith. It certainly is a view of life as we read down through these things. You have a great number of things which are saying, you know, existence, there is existence under the sun. And as these statements would indicate, they would be simply nothing but simply, someone described it as a vicious cycle or a monotonous cycle, the vanity of all human and mundane things, things which happen just over and over and over without any seemingly ultimate result or purpose as such. Let's read down through them rather quickly. Here he says in verse 4, one generation passeth, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. We understand that very easily, very simply. We stop and see day by day in our life as we read the obituary columns and as we are acquainted with our friends and neighbors, many now who are passing on into the realms of eternity. Here's a generation which is past, and we look around us, we see the birth of a newborn child. Here's another generation which comes forth. Well, that generation which comes forth, it grows up, becomes the older generation, it also passes, it goes away, and then yet another generation comes forth. But things that are, as far as the earth is concerned, from under the sun part of it, it doesn't go away, it just stays here. That doesn't mean the eternal earth is such, by the way. It just simply means it's things which are viewed from, yes, you got it, under the sun. That's what it's up. One generation, cycle after cycle after cycle. The sun also, here are three examples, 5, 6, and 7. The sun also arises, the sun goeth down. Hasteth the place where it rose. Did you ever get up in the morning and expect the sun to come up in the west or the south or the north? No, it's always going to come up in the east because that's where it always has come up. It's in that cycle. It settles in the west, then it goes around and comes back up the same place that it started over. One cycle. The wind, talks about in verse 6, goeth toward the south, turneth about unto the north, it worketh about continue, the wind returneth again according to his circuit. Here's a great Old Testament statement relative to the nature and the work and the design of God, relative to the use of winds, if you will. But man just sees the effect of winds as they come. They come and they go. They would go in a direction, they go around, and they come back again. And just continual movement of wind. We're thankful that they do that. But from the view of under the sun, that's all we see is the activity which takes place. The rivers, verse 7, I like this one. The rivers run into the sea, and the sea is not full. Have you ever thought about that? How many great rivers, like the Mississippi River, the Amazon River, Nile River, great, huge river, and many, many others not so huge, they're all emptying into the sea. It looks to me like that thing would finally just get full and run over. But it doesn't, does it? Well, why does it? Well, it says it's not full, and under the place from which the rivers come, thither they return again. So we have the cycle of the hydrological cycle of waters is what we have there. We observe that taking place, and from our observation, that's just what's taking place. All things, verse 8, he says, are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear full of hearing. The ear filled with hearing. So we look about us, and the world is filled with activities. It's busy, it's working, it's going, it's doing. You know, it's full of activity all about us. The eye. You can't feel the eye so full that it can't see anything else. Someone says, well, mine just can't see very well. It's not because it's been filled full. It's because you have some deterioration or eye damage. The ear. You never get the ear so full that it can't hear something else because it's full. Still has that great ability, if you will, in the process. We understand those things just from the earth's point of view, if you will. Verse 9, he kind of sums up somewhat. He says, the things that hath been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done. And here's an interesting expression. There is no new thing, watch it, under the sun. There's that phrase. No new thing. And he just talked about great things which take place, generation passing and coming, sun going down and coming up, wind blowing around about, rivers, the eye, the wonderful thing. But it's that which has always been from earth's point of view. No new thing under the sun. Verse 10, he says, is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before. Someone says, well, you don't understand, preacher. We have a lot of new things in our day and age. We have a lot of new gadgets, new ways of doing things, talking to people, but we're still talking to people. That's what we're doing. That hasn't changed at all. Different ways of traveling, we might say, we once had in this world, which we have now. But we still have the objective of traveling from one place to another. In general, as far as the basic fundamentals, we really haven't advanced in new things. We have limitations put upon us by the very nature of the world in which we live. It's good for us to think about that, if you will. Verse 11, listen a little closer. There's no remembrance. Someone says, I can go along with that. No remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come, and those that shall come after. Now, what's Solomon saying here? He said, now you stop and think about it. There's no remembrance of former things. Now, let's see, what's the name of your great-grandfather, great-grandmother, great-great-grand? Oh, I don't remember, nor do I. A lot of things which have taken place, and they're gone. The fellow says they're history, and not all of history. In fact, most of history is not recorded. It's there and it was gone, as such. And so we have no remembrance of those things. They're things that are here now, and things that are going to come. They're here now, and they're coming. There will come a time when there will be no remembrance of these things. Can you accept the idea that someday there's going to be a time, God willing, we have more time, that you won't even be a remembrance in somebody's mind, or I won't be a remembrance in somebody's mind. How do I know that? Because it's the case for us today, all those who have lived before us, and things which have taken place before us in the process. And so here's that cycle of life. Here's the process of life. Here is the life, if you will, what goes around about us. Here is that life without faith, without God. This is what life is said, without God. Someone says, sounds pretty good to me. Well, I really wouldn't draw that conclusion yet. Wouldn't draw that conclusion yet at all in the process. Let's turn our attention to number 12, verse 12. Here is the beginning of our second section. Brother Camp, in this section which we have labeled Demonstration of the Vanity of Things Under the Sun, which begins here and goes through chapter 6. Brother Camp puts this designation on it. He says, the king who experimented. The king who experimented. Solomon who experimented, if you will. And so he begins in chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. And he talks about the vanity of striving after wisdom and knowledge. Someone says, well, it ought to be a good thing to seek after wisdom and seek after knowledge, and not really a bad thing per se to do so. But if that's all there is to life, not too much is it. You remember Paul's statement to the church of the Lord over the city of Corinth in chapter 1, that great book? Here's what he said in chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. He says, where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? The wisdom of what? Of this world. And put that in the thoughts of your mind as you go back and read back in the book of Ecclesiastes, where it talks about the vanity of wisdom. That's what he's talking about there. Verse 21, for after that in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. How does that now begin, Paul? The world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God, he said, by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. And so when we go back in chapter 1, begin about verse 12 there, and we talk about the idea of vanity of striving after wisdom and after knowledge. Here's what Paul says. He says, I was preacher. I, the priest, was king over Israel. He says, I gave my heart to seek and to search out. You find this idea of I gave my heart expression frequent in the book of Ecclesiastes. He said, I made observation is the idea. He says, I thought about it and I made some observations about it. Seems to be the concept of it. To seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. Now on down in the same verse here, it talks about the idea again under the sun in verse 14. So under heaven, the same thing as under the sun. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of men to be exercised thereunto. What sort of travail are you talking about, Solomon here? Well, to search out wisdom concerning all things that are done. It's seeking out things that are done under heaven, under the sun, if you will. Solomon says, I've seen the works that are done under the sun. And he says, oh, all is vanity. This is verse 14. And vexation of spirit. We have a new phrase here. Vexation of spirit. Vanity and vexation of spirit, if you will. Interesting concept there, if you will. Vexation of spirit really carries the idea, by definition, of the unsatisfying nature of human endeavor. Vexation of spirit. Basically, it carries primarily the same concept of the idea of vanity, or vanity of vanities. Has no fruitful or satisfying or satisfactory results, if you will. So he talks about vexation of spirit, the unsatisfying nature of human endeavor. As such. Man is endeavoring, he's working all the works that God is saying there. He says in 15, that which is crooked cannot be made straight, that which is wanting cannot be numbered in the process. What do you mean, Son, that which is crooked cannot be made straight? Well, there are certain things in life about which we really can't fix as such. We know there are a lot of things in life which are not as they really ought to be, and we would like to try to do something to fix them, and maybe we can help along the way in some way, but there's some things, you know, it just can't be made straight, can't be fixed, if you will, in the process there. They're set, and someone said we have to learn to deal with it or learn not to deal with it, one or the other. And it's just the way life is in the process. It's things that are wanted. There are a lot of things that are wanted, and you know they're beyond and above our ability to meet the needs of. We see a lot of things we'd like to do something about, where it's beyond our ability perhaps to do something just from an earthly point of view. Do those things. We are glad to do it, to help to do what we can for that which is good, if you will. Here again he used the expression, verse 16, he said, I commune with my own heart. That is, I gave thought, I gave observation, thinking to it, if you will, in the process. It says, I'm come to great estate. Here's Solomon's assessment of himself. I've come to great estate, I've gotten more wisdom, and all they that have given to me have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart hath great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Remember the Lord when Solomon prayed for the Lord, and back in 1 Kings chapter 3, I believe it is. God said he would give Solomon wisdom which is greater than ever had been, or that which ever would be in the process. Solomon was a man of wisdom. We recognize that from a biblical perspective as such. That doesn't mean that he always made the right choices in life as such. But he was one who possessed that ability there. And he says, all they that have been before me in Jerusalem, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. None had been as wise as Solomon. In fact, his wisdom was, in fact, in his day, worldwide as such. So he gave his heart to know wisdom, verse 17. And he says also, now notice, to know madness and folly. How can you know wisdom and know madness and folly, which would seem to be the direct opposite of the other? Might make a note on over in chapter 2 and verse 12. He also says, I turn myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. Seems to be the idea that Solomon says, I'm going to examine, I'm going to experiment, as Brother Camp would suggest. I'm going to experiment not only with the idea of wisdom, but also the other side of matters pertaining to life, and to experiment with those things too, to see just what they are. And he says, for in as much wisdom as much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow, in the last verse. And that's an interesting expression. In wisdom there is much grief. How so? Why is there much grief in wisdom? Sometimes the more we know, it causes and brings us sorrow and sadness to us. Now knowledge can be helpful, and we ought to obtain knowledge, good knowledge, right knowledge in the process, keeping God as a part of it, the process. But sometimes, I remember one time, just as an illustration, there was a sister who actually was the wife of a deacon in the Lord's church a long time ago. And she made the observation, she had 3 fine sons, and sons are teenagers. She says, I don't want to know what all my sons get into when they're not at home. And when I heard her say that, I sort of scratched my head and thought about that. And then come to find the idea is, you know, when parents find out that their children do that, which is not appropriate, right, it causes harm and hurt and agony and such. Perhaps that's the idea that Solomon's expressed here. Sometimes we learn things which cause us great sadness and sorrow in the process. We may learn of a close one's death we didn't know about. That brings sadness and sorrow to us. We may learn of a terrible disease or something which might cause death to one of our family members. That would bring us sadness and sorrow in the process. So there is that danger which takes place. In verse 17, he says, I gave my heart to know this wisdom, to know madness of folly. Now when we get into chapter 2, we're going to see some demonstrations of that as such, and it's demonstration of the vanity of things under the sun. He began back in chapter 1. And I am going to give you a list. And I'm going to suggest that you write this list down in the process. Some 6 things of which it is said are vain things. And from the text, the general text from which we're studying, we're going to pick up again in chapter 2 and go more on a verse by verse. But some 6 things here. Beginning back up in chapter 1 in verse 14, says, all the works done by men are vain, vanity, and vexation of spirit. And so that's one thing that Solomon says is vain. Number 1, all the works done by men, chapter 1 and verse 14. Number 2, chapter 2 and begin verse 1 is the second one. And this would include everything which is of pleasurable. And so, pleasure, and we'll talk about that more at length and add some associated thoughts with it when we get to it. He says those things are too. He says this also is vanity, a joy, pleasures, verse 1, this also is vanity. And then on down in chapter 2 and about verse 21, talks about all the activities and labor. And he says here, or profitless here in the process. This also is vanity and great evil. And wisdom there. So all the labor there, and he hath, shall he leave for his portion there. He says that's vanity. All of your work, all of your labor in the process. Seems rather strange, but we'll get to that shortly in the process. And then on down in chapter 2, and let me go back and give a correction on it. I believe that should be chapter 2 and verse 11. Let's go back and change that note. We're going back to 21 later. Chapter 2 and verse 11. He says, all the works of my hands, he said, I labor to do. He says, with vanity and vexation. So all the works, that would be number 3, chapter 2 and verse 11. And then chapter 4, or chapter 2 and verse about 13 through 15, will be number 4, vanity. And this vanity here has to do with the idea of striving for wisdom. Seems to be, again, rather strong, but we talked about that back in the early part of chapter 1. And look at chapter 1 and down about we go down to verse 15, then we're going to back up a little bit. He says in verse 10, he says, then I said in my heart, as it happened to the fool, so it happened even unto me. Why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. Well, what's he talking about? Well, back up in verse 13, he says, I saw that wisdom excelleth folly. Good observation. As far as light excelleth darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head. They're working, they're seeing, they're being able to help him. But the fool walketh in darkness. He doesn't know where he's going. And I myself perceived also that one event happened to them all. And so he said in my heart, as it happened to the fool, so what happened to me? Of course, that one event, you know, would be what? You're right. Be death. Whether you're a fool or whether you're a wise man, whether you're walking in the light or whether you're walking in the darkness, ends up one event happens to both. And so he says, as far as his striving for wisdom, then he says that's vanity. And then on over in chapter 2 and verse 21, talks about earthly accomplishments. Earthly accomplishments requires a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity, yet to a man that hath not labored therein, that is, in wisdom and knowledge and equity, therein shall he leave it for his portion. This is also vanity and evil, and a great evil. So the idea simply is this, that a man who labors out of wisdom and hard work and all and gains and whatever, when he dies, he leaves it, his portions there, and so, as we say, sometimes you can't take it with you. And so all that labor, Solomon says, also is vanity. We'll keep it in context. And then, finally, in number 6, we'll go to chapter 3 and verse 19. And this simply points out that an overemphasis, chapter 3, verse 19, an overemphasis on life and living. Seems strange. Let's see what it says. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they all have one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above the beast, for all is vanity. And so life under the sun, viewed only apart from God, that's the end of it. No different than the beast. And so an overemphasis on life and living then, Solomon says, is vanity. Let's go back and look at some of the things in chapter 2 in the early part. Had it in my mind, had it in my heart, gave thought for consideration, made observation about it. He says, I'm going to prove you with mirth, enjoy pleasure, and he says this is vanity. Mirth, pleasure, joy, things of that nature. Proverbs 14:13 says, even in laughter the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that which is heaviness. And so probably the idea of pleasure, and he speaks of laughter in verse 2, says it is mad of mirth, what doeth. We could spend our life going through things. It may be the party spirit where we enjoy, we're laughing and doing this and doing that. But it wanes quickly. It's really of no true value to us in life as such. And it's just a moment in time in the process there. He says that. He says, I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine. Verse 3 there. Process. Yet acquainted my heart with wisdom and to lay hold on folly. So wine and folly, they usually go together, the process. That I might see what was good for the sons of men. He said, I'm doing this for the process and making an observation to experiment with the things and affairs of life to see what is actually good from a point of experimentation as such. And to do what the sons of men, which they should do under heaven all the days of their life. Doing under heaven here goes back to the idea back in chapter 1, verse 13, which is equivalent to the idea of under the sun in verse 14 in chapter 1. So again, under the sun is the idea which is to be expressed there in that particular place. Here's what Solomon said he did. Let's look at chapter 2 and begin about verse 4. And Solomon go back and he says, I go back and I look at my own life. And so here's what's taking place. Look at it. He says, I made me great works. I builded me house. You remember Solomon is one who built the temple in Jerusalem. That indeed was a great work, among many others. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards. I planted trees and them of all kinds of fruits. I made me pools of water to water there with the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens and had servants born in mine house. And also I had great possession of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. Solomon says, I had more than anybody had ever had in Jerusalem before. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. I got me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men. I had some musical instruments, and that of all sorts. In fact, he says in verse 9, so I was great, and I increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also, he says, my wisdom remained with me. Pretty good assessment of Solomon's life. He says, whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I held not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion in all my labor. Now, there's a key thought that's introduced here I want us not to overlook, if you will. Solomon has just got through speaking of the great things he had done in his life, how he was great. None had more than him, none were wiser than him, and he was successful. He says, my heart rejoiced in my labor. In his work. And he said in verse 11, I looked on the work so that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labor to do. And he says, behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. That which we find is that Solomon, greatest achievement that he seemed to extol more than other was the fact of the labor itself, not necessarily those things which were produced as a subject of his labor. So he turned and he thought to myself, in verse 12 he said, Wisdom and madness and folly, what can a man do that cometh after the king, even that which hath been done already? Solomon simply raised his weapon. Going back and looking and under surveillance of my life, what I have done, what I have built, what I have achieved, my greatness, my wealth, my wisdom, he says, the fellow that comes after me, what's he going to do that's going to exceed that? You know, that seems to be the normal course of events. A man's thinking that somebody who's going to play the next role in some form or fashion seems to be compelled. He's going to have to do something greater. You know, the fellow coming into office after Solomon, which was his son Rehoboam, he's going to have a hard chore to meet. And in fact, Rehoboam, as you very well know, was a miserable failure as his next king after Solomon. And so Solomon says, what's he going to do? And there's that word then in verse 13. He said, I saw that wisdom excelleth folly. That's good. As far as light excelleth darkness. Light beats darkness. The wise man's eyes are those in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness, and I myself perceived also that one event happened to them all. Wise man has eyes, he's seeing, he's walking in the light, if you will, seeing where he's going. The fool is just walking in darkness, doesn't know where he's going. But the end result is that the same thing happens to both the wise man and the fool. And he says, I said in my heart, this also is vanity. Now let's think about that for just a moment. What is it that Solomon said is vanity? He said it's vanity because the wise man, because wisdom excels folly, the wise man who has eyes that see walks in the light, and the fool is the man who is incapable of being taught. That's basically who the fool is. He is the man who walks in darkness, and when it's all said and done, the same thing happens to the wise man with wisdom as happens to the fool. And of course that would be death. No remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever. We go back again, we talked about earlier the idea of remembering those who are in previous generations. We don't remember them because they're no longer part of our mindset, if you will. The man who is wise and wisdom and does well and does great, you know, he's not going to be remembered also. He's going to soon be forgotten. That's the normal course of events. Now, some whose lives are written up in books may be remembered longer, if you will, because of that. But generally speaking, that's the way things go in that. Seeing that which is in the days to come shall be forgotten, how dieth the wise man? Answer, as the fool. As the fool's process. So Solomon says in verse 17, I hated my life, because the works wrought under the sun is grievous. The work wrought under the sun is grievous unto me. All is vanity and vexation of spirit, unsatisfying nature of human endeavor, and because I should leave it unto the man that should be after me. Solomon says, all this I have done, I have worked, I have labored, and when the end comes, I'm simply going to leave it to the fellow who comes after me. And again, we mentioned Rehoboam a moment ago. Rehoboam was the one who came after Solomon, and as you know, he did not do very well. Go back and read 1 Kings chapter 12 and get the idea. Who knoweth whether there's going to be a wise man or fool? The next one in line. Who knows what it's going to be like? I don't know. Sometimes we have children and we're thankful for them. They're inherited of the Lord, the Bible says. And we really don't know where they're going to raise them. We're going to raise them up. We do the best we can. We try to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But they're going to make choices in life. Whether they end up being wise men or fools, we don't really know. You know, it says, he says, wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun, he says, this is vanity. Just don't know the part. Take a moment, go with me back to the book of Psalms, chapter 49, Psalm 49, for just a moment. Let's get a similar idea of it. Perhaps it'll help us in our thinking along this particular point. Psalm 49. Hear this, all you people, all you inhabitants of the world, both high, low and high, rich and poor, together. And we're going to drop on down to about verse 10, I believe, in the process there, and pick up on it. Where he says this, for he that seeth the wise men die, likewise the fool and the brutish person perisheth, and leave their wealth to others. Their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. They call their lands after their own names. Point being made by the psalmist here, our general thinking is if we do well and do great and we leave plenty and powerful things to our next generation, that they're all going to be doing well and great with that thing. But that's not the case, if you will. Sometimes people grow up and they have them named, they have lands named, towns named after them, and lands named after them. But that doesn't mean that the next generation is going to be well. Nevertheless, man, verse 12, being in honor abideth not. He is like the beasts that perish. That's what Solomon said over in the book of Ecclesiastes. This their way is their folly, yet their posterity approve their sayings. Like sheep they are laid in the grave. Death shall feed on them, and the upright shall have dominion over them in the morning, and their beauty shall consume in the grave from the ground. Life is transitory, to say the least, in the process. And so Solomon says this about that. We're going to be bringing our thoughts to a close on this particular idea here. He says in 17, therefore I hated life. Now that's quite a statement. Why, Solomon? Well, here. Because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me. I've thought about the work that's done. He said, life, as I've seen it, I experienced some of it, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. 18, yea, I hated all my labor, which I had taken under the sun. That's what his life was all about. His labor, his life, if you will. Because, he said, I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. Okay, he can't take it. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool, yet shall he have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, wherein I have showed myself wise on the sun. This also, Solomon says, is vanity. And so verse 20, he says this, therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. Well, someone says, well, does that mean then that all the work that we're doing is just worthless and no good, and we ought not be concerned about getting out and working? No, we need to remember things in God's sight. Remember what Paul said, 1 Corinthians 15:58? Be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in what? In the work of the Lord. For as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. That's the difference, dear folks, in the Lord. But take the Lord part out, what do you have? Stuff. What are you going to do with it? Save it up. Who's going to get it? The next fella. What kind of fella he's going to be? You don't know. You don't know what's going to happen to your stuff. He may have it and he may not have it. And so there's a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and equity, yet to a man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it for his portion. This is vanity and great evil. So leave it to someone else. Wise man to say it is vanity and great evil. We're going to pick up next Monday evening here also about verse 22 and 23. We want to encourage you, number one, this is an assignment. Read the book of Ecclesiastes. I want you, if at all possible, to find time to sit down and read it in its entirety in one setting. Read it with the idea of taking note of these terms vanity, vanity of vanities, and under the sun. And notice we're going to have a transition in thought when we get down to the end of chapter 2, because God is then going to be entered into the picture more fully as Solomon is going to continue his discussion as such. But your assignment, other than doing your study questions, of course, would be to read the book of Ecclesiastes prayerfully at least one time, fully, all the way through during the next week. Thank you so much for being a part of our class. Good evening to you.